Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Pipines, longtime TV sportscaster in Milwaukee, and I am joined by John Dodds. He's a Packers savant, and we're here to talk about Bart Starr. What an amazing man, what an amazing football player. We have a podcast together, a video podcast. You can Google The Tom Pipines Show or go to tompipins.com, even though he's the star of the show. 40 years on the scene covering the Packers, although he's smart enough to have been an attorney and he's got real estate, but he's got all kinds of things going on. John, your experiences regarding Bart Starr, you covered him when he was the head coach of the Green and Gold.
Sure, when I was at Marquette, I was able to get a job at Green Bay on game days, 1979. So I covered the last 4 or 5 years of the Bart Starr era. And just as a step back before I get into that, Bart Starr, probably of all the sports figures, of all the people I've known in sports, by far the nicest person I've ever met. Whether I would ask as a kid for his autograph, if a kid came up and he could tell that he was given an autograph and he was going to give it back to some collector who was going to sell it, he would talk to him a little bit and convince him not to do it and why he shouldn't do it and could you get that thing back. And so he would get the autograph back and he would personalize it to the kid to make it less valuable for the collector. Yeah. So he would do anything for the fans. And I remember he'd say to me, I said, "Mr. Starr, could you autograph this for me?" And I had a quarterback sneak of Sports Illustrated. And he would say, "Hi, what's your name?" John Dodds. And he'd say, "John, great to meet you, Bart Starr." And he'd shake my hand, and then it was, "To John, a great Packer fan, best wishes, Bart Starr."
And you know, John, to your point, if I may, here's a book
Yep.
that Jason Ruck, behind the scenes guru, gave us. His father had this personalized by Bart back in the late 60s. Again, to Jim,
Right.
best wishes type of thing, Bart Starr. And he was the type of man who would remember your name if in his prime, "John, good to see you." He would remember you if he met you, who knows, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, and he always treated everyone the same, whether it was the president of a company or an intern just starting. As you say, the nicest man you ever met, and I might go so far as to say one of the nicest men I ever met beyond the sports world. He happened to be a 5-time NFL champion, 2-time Super Bowl MVP, but the world lost a great human being above and beyond what he accomplished on the gridiron, and yet it was the coaching situation that didn't work out.
It didn't, and I had the privilege of introducing him in 2008 at the Milwaukee Athletic Club for the pen and mic. They asked me to do that. And I was 48 at the time, and I followed him. I started following the Packers in the mid-'60s because my dad would watch the TV, and they won every week. So I got hooked at an early age. So I thought most of the people at the luncheon wouldn't remember him as the player. They would remember him as the failed coach. So what I did is I introduced him, and I said, "Here's a Hall of Fame. It's my privilege to introduce Hall of Famer Bart Starr." And I gave his background. I said, similar to Aaron Rodgers' background with Green Bay, in that the first 3 or 4 years Bart was drafted, they tried him at defensive back, running back, quarterback. He really didn't fit. And they didn't know what they had. And so he was there as a sub, and Lombardi didn't know what he had either. And he came in 59, and in 60, he was still trying to trade for a quarterback. He wasn't sold on Bart Starr. But then in 61, 62, he was a key spoke in the wheel. They had 11 other Hall of Famers. It was Horning and Taylor and Jerry Kramer, Forrest Gregg, Jim Ringo. They had all the really good players that carried them to the 61 and 62 championships. And Bart never got the full, probably, credit. But then an interesting thing happened, and I mentioned this to the crowd, that as the team around him got older, he went from the spoke of the wheel to the hub of the wheel. And by 65, 66, and 67, he was carrying that team on the field to the point where Marie Lombardi would say, "The key to the Packers is my Vince off the field and Bart Starr on the field." And so by 65 and 66, like Aaron Rodgers, Bart Starr became the MVP of the NFL. One of the signature players, really a signature player in the nation, because the NFL was the first made-for-TV sport, and Pete Rozelle did a great job of marketing it. So, and probably the greatest sports name ever, Bart Starr. If you had to think of a Hollywood name for a superhero, Bart Starr. So he won those 3 championships, and then in kind of a sad thing, he hurt his shoulder in '67 and '68, and by '71, his final game was at the Miami Dolphin final game of the season. He could barely throw to the tight end 10 yards over, and Miami, I remember, put everybody in the box because they knew he couldn't do anything. So he retired after that, after the '71 season, after I think it was 16 years with the Packers. And then Dan Devine came on as coach, and in the second year, he asked Bart to be offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach. So Bart called the plays that year, and Green Bay had a playoff year. That was the one year Dan Devine got them in. They had John Brockington, MacArthur Lane, and they had 2 pop gun quarterbacks with Scott Hunter and Jerry Tagey, and it was Bart Starr calling all the plays. So they finished 10-4 that year in '72, and they're playing the Washington Redskins and George Allen in the playoffs. And Dan Devine was known to have a very big ego, and he thought that Bart Starr was getting too much credit. So for that game, he took those play call responsibilities away from Bart, and he put it on himself. And in that game, George Allen thought so little of the Packer passing game that he put an extra defensive lineman in. They had 5 defensive linemen to stop the Packer running game, and they took out a safety, and it did. And the Packers only had 3 points, and the play calls were terrible, and Bart Starr was so upset that he quit after that. And
as you know, he was a play caller himself on the football field. They called all their plays back then, and he was just amazing that way.
And he had the feel
Yeah,
and the experience,
right.
But it was Dan Devine's ego. So Bart Starr got along with everyone. There were exceptions. One of them was Dan Devine, and from that point on, Chuck Lane was his was the PR director up in Green Bay, and Dan Devine then viewed Bart Starr as kind of the enemy, trying to take my job. And Bart wanted that job. Bart did not like Dan Devine. Bart thought that he was the guy for the job. So he took that. He ended up, when Devine went to Notre Dame in 1974, if you've seen the movie Rudy, he leaves Green Bay and goes to Notre Dame in for the '75 season. So Bart took over.
He's the guy who didn't want Rudy to play, right? They had to go to finally he gets on the field.
Exactly.
He takes over, and at some point in time, he admits, I was just starting to become a good coach when I was let go. He really was not ready to be a head coach at that time, was he?
I think the best comment I heard about that at the time was Bart Starr wanted to be a coach in the worst way, and that's how he started. His first game, to show you how he wasn't ready, and what he said, looking back on it, what I should have done is gone to Tom Landry in Dallas and learned what they were doing and learned a little bit more of the craft. The first game in County Stadium, they played Detroit, and they lost a game when they gave up 3 blocked punts. So there was like a hole in the dike, 3 blocked punts. I mean, I've never seen that before or since. And they lost the game just barely, but they started off 0-4. And getting back to the Milwaukee Athletic Club introduction, when I talking to Mrs. Starr, Cherry, beforehand, I said it was really too bad that Ron Wolf wasn't there when you came on. She said, absolutely. I said, Dan Devine made that John Hadel trade. They called it the Lawrence Welk deal, where he gave a 1, a 2, and a 3, and then a 1 and a 2.
For those who don't remember Lawrence, right, it's a 1 and a 2 and a 3.
And a 3.
Yeah.
So he gave up the first 3 picks in the '75 draft and the first 2 picks of the '76 draft for a 34-year-old quarterback. And it was a desperation move to save Dan Devine's job because he needed a quarterback. And so Bart inherited John Hadel and not many high picks. And I mentioned that to Cherry Starr, and she turned to me and said, but remember, when in 1976 and '77, we let Ted Hendricks go. And that was one of Bart's big blunders. The best player on the team was Ted Hendricks. He let Ted Hendricks go kind of pulling a Lombardi, being a tough negotiator. So Ted Hendricks goes to Oakland, signs with Al Davis for big money, and Pete Rozelle awards Green Bay 2 number 1 picks. And Cherry Starr turned to me and said they took Mark Konkar, the offensive tackle, and then they took Ezra Johnson, the defensive end, with those picks. And I looked at her.
Most noted Ezra for eating a hot dog on the sidelines.
For
right?
eating the hot dog. But what struck me about that, I said, Mrs. Starr, there's probably 5 people in this room of 400 that knew what you just said. I mean, I followed it closely. I remember exactly that. Bart would always say that Cherry Starr had my back. And whenever Bart would come into a room, Cherry would always make sure that he had his meds, he had some food, always worrying about Bart. And she reminded me a little bit of Joni Creen, who would do the same thing for Tom. And Tom Creen, when he was at Marquette, would turn to me and say, she really has my back, doesn't she? I said, she really does. And that's what Cherry Starr reminded me. Just everything was the focus on Bart.
Yeah.
So anyway, I finished the introduction, and I said, so you won a championship. Here he is. He was a coach for the Packers. Here he is, Bart Starr. Bart gets up, shakes my hand, and says, John, I could have sat here and listened to those kind words for the entire day. In fact, I thought I was going to have to. So I thought I just got dissed by the nicest guy
in the nicest way possible.
In the nicest way possible.
Because that was number 15. You talk about Cherry. He loved that woman from the time they were kids until he worshipped her. It was an example of a marriage, a union that we could probably all learn from. It was certainly a beautiful thing. What will you most remember about Bart Starr?
How he treated the dignity, how he treated everybody with respect. And then you had a good point before that he learned how to coach on the job, and he left being a lot better coach than he started as. And he just needed somebody, all you have to do is look over his draft picks to see what happened. His best draft was the 78 draft. He took James Lofton, Hall of Famer, and John Anderson, your former colleague on Fox 6. And, but then in 1979 was kind of probably the worst possible thing that could happen to Green Bay and the Bart Starr era. They drafted Eddie Lee Ivory, number 1, and he was a franchise back. And in the final exhibition game, had a 46-yard run and a 46-yard catch, both for touchdowns against Atlanta at County Stadium. The next week, they handed it to him 3 times. He ran for 47 yards and on the Soldier Field turf, put his foot in the ground and blew his ACL. Yeah. And then he did it again 2 years later. So he was only just a fraction of what he could have been, and that was too bad. That 79 draft, also in the 3rd round, the director of personnel wanted them to take a quarterback out of Notre Dame named Joe Montana in the 3rd round, and he begged him, Bart, to take Joe Montana. But Hog Hanner was the defensive line coach, coordinator, and they were changing from a 4-3 to a 3-4, and they needed a nose tackle, and they had a perfect guy, Charles Johnson, out of Maryland. So they passed on Joe Montana. So passing on Joe Montana and the Eddie Lee Ivory was kind of the beginning of the end. Then an unusual thing happened in '80. They had a very horrible season, and they drafted Bruce Clark, the top defensive lineman out of Penn State. And I know fans today couldn't identify with this, but he came into Green Bay, and nobody met him at the airport. And he went to, I think it was a Denny's, and he spent 3 or 4 hours at a Denny's. And he wanted to be a chef, and he was all into culinary and cooking, and he was bored, didn't want to play, called his agent, and I think he signed with the Canadian Football League, because they took him from the airport to all the great restaurants around, and so he left. And I remember thinking, you need a player like that. Mm-hmm. Then the next year he took Rich Campbell, number 6, because he needed a quarterback. And the next year, Bob Schnelker came on as offensive coordinator, and he said, they asked him if he liked Rich Campbell, and he said, No, he changed his throwing motion after he had that shoulder injury at California. I'm thinking, what? I mean, here, he used to be 6'6",
Yep.
and he hurt his shoulder,
They would-
so he started throwing like this, so he threw like he was 5'8".
Yeah.
And why would you take the 6th pick when his personnel director wanted Ronnie Lott? So it was a personnel problem with the draft picks. So I'll remember the incredible player, the signature player of the 60s, really, classy and on TV, but probably if he had just had a GM that could have drafted for him and made decisions, I think he would have been successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll remember sitting with him at a Lombardi dinner with my wife and allowing Sally to have that Super Bowl ring in her face. She still talks about that. I'll remember, sadly, the passing of his son,
Yeah.
Brett. Bart going to the home and then calling authorities, drug overdose. He had struggled. Supposedly he was doing better, and then he passed. And I once asked him, I said, Bart, how did you possibly get through that? Obviously a man of deep faith. He said, Tom, it's attitude. It's attitude every single day, an attitude of gratitude. And I said, wow, that's something I think we could all learn from. As you pointed out at the beginning, just one of the greatest human beings ever, and a privilege. If you got to know him, it's one of those men you came away feeling that you're a little better for that experience. So I appreciate the experience being with you here, John Dodds, talking about the legendary Bart Starr. And just a reminder again, we can be found at the Tom Pipins Show or tompipins.com. But again, I always say the real star is the Packer savant, and I think you'll probably believe me now after listening to John Dodds. Thank you, JD.
Thank you, Pip.
All right, take care, everyone. We look forward to your company again right here.